She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't post a statement. She didn't give a single interview explaining what was really happening behind closed doors. She just disappeared. And when she came back as something entirely different. If you think you already understand what Lisa is building, what LLOUD actually represents, and what alter ego was always meant to be, then you haven't been watching closely enough. Because there are layers to this story that have never been fully unpacked. Layers that a solo documentary, if it ever surfaces, would not be able to hide. What you're about to hear isn't just about music. It's about power, identity, and one artist's very deliberate, very calculated decision to rewrite every rule that was written for her. Stay with this until the end. Because the detail that changes everything doesn't come at the beginning. It comes when you least expect it. Part 1. The setup. Lisa beyond BLACKPINK, or... To understand where Lisa is going, you have to understand what she left. BLACKPINK was, by almost any metric, the most successful girl group in the history of K-pop. 4 women, 1 label, and a global footprint that reached places the Korean music industry had never touched before. Lisa was part of that. She was essential to that. But she was also, in a very specific way, contained by it. When her YG Entertainment contract expired in 2023, the entertainment world waited. Would she re-sign? Would she follow her bandmates into the next chapter of the BLACKPINK era? The answer came slowly, and it came sideways. Not in a press release, but in the architecture of what she built afterward. She didn't sign with a competitor label. She didn't attach herself to an existing system and call it independence. She built her own. That decision, to create LLOUD, her own company on her own terms, is not the kind of move a person makes impulsively. It is the kind of move that is years in the planning. Years of watching how the machine operates. Years of understanding exactly what leverage you have, and waiting for the precise moment to use it. Here is what makes Lisa's trajectory. Unlike almost anyone else in the K-pop ecosystem, she already had the audience before she had the freedom. Most artists spend their early solo years trying to build a fan base from scratch. Lisa didn't need to do that. She walked out of BLACKPINK with hundreds of millions of followers across social platforms, a solo track, Money, that had become a genuine cultural phenomenon years after its release, and a global name recognition that required exactly 0 explanation in any language. That is an extraordinary position to be in. And it raises a question that no press interview has ever answered directly. How much of what you're about to see was planned from the very beginning? The version of Lisa that the world knew inside BLACKPINK was meticulous, powerful, technically flawless. She was the dancer, the performer, the one whose stage presence could fill an arena all by itself. But performance and artistry are not the same thing. And for years, there were signals, subtle ones, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, that she was operating at the surface of something much deeper. In interviews, she rarely spoke about her music in purely commercial terms. She spoke about feeling things on stage, about expression, about the gap between what people expected her to be and what she actually was. That gap is where LLOUD was born. And that gap is exactly what a documentary would expose. Part 2. LLOUD, the label nobody fully understands. Or, if you've stayed with this video up to now, what I'm about to tell you reframes everything you thought you knew about LLOUD. Most people, even engaged fans, describe LLOUD as Lisa's label. And technically, yes, that's accurate. But that framing undersells what it actually is. LLOUD isn't just a vehicle for releasing music. It is a structural argument about what an artist in 2024 and beyond should look like. Let's start with the name itself. LLOUD. 2 L's. The second one is silent, and yet it's there. Deliberate, doubled, insisting on itself. That is not an accident. This is an artist who has spent years thinking about how to present herself, down to the most granular visual and linguistic detail. The branding of LLOUD, its visual language, its minimalist logo, its restrained but commanding aesthetic, communicates something very specific. This is not an entertainment company built around a personality. This is a company built around a vision. That distinction matters enormously in the K-pop industry, where the typical model places the artist at the center of a corporate ecosystem they do not control. The label owns the music. The label controls the image. The label determines the release schedule, the collaborations, the territories, the merchandise. The artist is the product. Lisa, by building LLOUD, inverted that model. She is the company. The music is hers. The vision is hers. And the partnerships, including a major distribution arrangement with RCA Records and Sony Music, were entered into on her terms, not the other way around. Now here's the part that doesn't get discussed nearly enough. Building a label from scratch as an artist is not a creative decision. It is a business decision. And business decisions of that magnitude, in an industry as relationship-dependent and infrastructure-heavy as the global music market, require a level of strategic sophistication that goes well beyond writing a great song. Who is advising her? Who built the legal framework? Who negotiated the distribution terms? Who is managing the intellectual property portfolio? These are questions that, publicly, remain largely unanswered. And that deliberate opacity is itself a signal. LLOUD operates with a kind of controlled silence that is the opposite of how most celebrity-adjacent ventures are run. There are no leaks. There are no insider sources speaking to trade publications. There are no off-the-record conversations finding their way into gossip columns. In an industry that runs on information, where knowing what's happening before it's announced is the currency of power, LLOUD runs dark. That is not an accident. That is a policy. And what a documentary set inside LLOUD would reveal, not just the music, but the infrastructure, the decision-making, the conversations, would be the most revealing document the K-pop industry has ever produced. There's one more dimension to LLOUD that almost never gets addressed, what it represents for other artists watching from inside their own contracts. We will return to that. But first, we need to talk about the thing that LLOUD was always building toward. Part 3. Alter ego, the character inside the artist, or here's where things get complicated. And complicated, in this context, means interesting. Alter ego is not just a music project. It is not just an aesthetic, or a theme, or a chapter title on a track list. If you read the signals carefully, and there are signals everywhere, if you know where to look, alter ego is a philosophical statement about the relationship between an artist and the identity that is constructed around them. Let's be precise about what we mean. Every major artist who has undergone a significant reinvention has, at some point, created a version of themselves that exists slightly outside of themselves. Beyoncé had Sasha Fierce. David Bowie had Ziggy Stardust. These weren't just marketing devices. They were psychological tools, ways of accessing a creative state that the real person couldn't always reach directly. Lisa's alter ego follows a similar logic, but with an added layer of complexity. Because Lisa, Lalisa Manobal, has been performing as a constructed identity since she was a teenager. YG's training system doesn't produce artists in the conventional sense. It produces highly refined performers who have been shaped, over years, into a very specific product. The Lisa that debuted with BLACKPINK was real, but she was also curated. Her fashion, her accent, her public persona, all of it had been refined through a system with specific commercial outcomes in mind. So when Lisa creates an alter ego, the question isn't simply, who is this new character? The more interesting question is, which version of Lisa is the original, and which one is the alter ego? The creative direction that surrounds alter ego is worth examining closely. The visual language is darker, more abstract, more cinematic than anything from the BLACKPINK era. There's an emphasis on performance as ritual rather than performance as entertainment. The choreography, if you look at how Lisa has moved in her solo work versus group settings, prioritizes expression over precision, which is actually a reversal of the technical virtuosity that defined her reputation. This is not a coincidence. Artists don't accidentally start moving differently. They move differently when they are trying to say something different. What is she saying? The most compelling read is this. Alter ego is Lisa's argument that the version of herself the world fell in love with was always an incomplete picture. Not false, but incomplete. And the documentary, if it exists and if it goes where it should, would be the first time audiences see what was missing from that picture. There's a detail in how alter ego was announced and revealed that most commentary missed entirely. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a massive campaign with synchronized global rollout and a coordinated media blitz. It arrived quietly, in pieces, almost as if it was being discovered rather than launched. That is an incredibly deliberate choice in an era when everything in the music industry is engineered for maximum visibility on day one. Lisa built anticipation not by shouting, but by going quiet. Think about that for a moment. This is one of the most followed human beings on the planet. She could generate cultural conversation by posting a blank image. And instead of using that power to blast a new project into the cultural stratosphere, she chose restraint. That is the move of someone who trusts the work more than the noise. And it is the move that a documentary would finally explain, because the reasoning behind it, the intention behind it, is the kind of thing that cannot be conveyed in a 3-minute music video or a 200-word Instagram caption. Part 4. what the documentary could expose, or now we get to the heart of it. A solo documentary for an artist of Lisa's profile, and in the current media landscape, this is not speculation, it is a matter of when, rather than if, would be unlike any K-pop documentary produced before it. Not because of what it would show, because of what it would have to explain. Let's walk through what a serious, honest documentary about LLOUD and alter ego would need to address. The question of creative control. During her years at YG Entertainment, Lisa was prolific. She performed constantly, contributed to global tours, appeared in promotional material, released solo music. But the defining creative decisions, what to release, when, in what format, with what aesthetic, were not solely hers. This is the standard arrangement at a major K-pop label, and it is not inherently a negative one. The system produces extraordinary results. But it also means that an artist can spend years building a global career and still not know exactly what their own creative instincts would produce in an unconstrained environment. LLOUD is that unconstrained environment. And a documentary would, for the first time, show what Lisa does when nobody is editing her choices. When the decision about a music video director, a collaborator, a sound palette, a release window, is entirely, irrevocably hers. That footage, if it exists, and documentary production typically generates enormous amounts of behind-the-scenes material, would be extraordinary to watch. Not because it would be dramatic, but because it would be honest. The transition nobody fully saw. There is a period between when Lisa's YG contract ended and when LLOUD was formally announced that exists, publicly, almost as a blank space. She did not disappear in a way that generated concern. She was still present. But she was present in a way that, looking back, feels like someone who is very intentionally not revealing what they're working on. What was happening in that window? Based on what we now know about LLOUD's structure and its partnerships, the answer is almost certainly everything. Legal entity formation, partnership negotiations, creative development. The architecture of an entirely new professional life was being built in plain sight, and almost no one noticed. A documentary that had access to that period, even retrospectively, through interviews and archival footage, would fill in a chapter of her story that currently reads as a gap. And gaps, in the context of an artist's biography, are where the most important truths tend to live. The personal dimension. There is a human story here that tends to get buried under the business narrative, and a documentary would have to surface it. Lisa left Thailand as a teenager to train in Seoul. She spent years in a system designed to produce excellence under enormous pressure. She achieved everything that system promised was possible, and then some. And then she chose to leave it. That is not a simple decision, emotionally. Institutions that demand everything from you, and that give you global recognition in return, create a kind of gravity. Walking away from that gravity, by choice, requires a level of self-knowledge and self-trust that is genuinely rare. A documentary that explored that internal process, the doubt, the reasoning, the moment of commitment, would be the most intimate portrait of an artist in the K-pop world that has ever been produced. Not because it would reveal scandal, but because it would reveal something more valuable than scandal. It would reveal the inside of a decision. What it could reveal about the future. Here is the thing about a documentary produced by an artist who still has decades of career ahead of her. It isn't just a retrospective. It is also a manifesto. LLOUD and alter ego, taken together, read as an argument, a very articulate, very considered argument, about what Lisa believes music should be, what an artist's relationship to their work should look like, and what the global entertainment industry should be capable of producing. A documentary would make that argument explicit. And when it does, it will not be addressing just her fan base. It will be addressing every label executive, every talent manager, every artist currently sitting inside a contract wondering what their options actually are. Part 5. Why this matters for the future of K-pop solos. Or, step back from Lisa for a moment. Step back from LLOUD and alter ego and all the detail we've been examining. And ask a larger question. Why does this matter beyond the fan base? The K-pop industry is one of the most sophisticated cultural export machines in modern entertainment history. It has produced global stars at a rate and scale that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago. But it has done so through a model that, by design, retains control at the institutional level. The label system in K-pop is not uniquely exploitative compared to the history of the global music industry. But it is unusually rigid. The training model, the exclusive contracts, the managed public image, the synchronized career arcs, these are features, not bugs. They are what makes the product so consistent and so commercially reliable. But consistency and creative freedom are often in tension. And what Lisa is doing with LLOUD represents the most high-profile stress test that tension has ever faced. Because if she succeeds, and by any early measure, the evidence suggests she will have demonstrated something the industry would prefer to remain undemonstrated, that you can take the platform built inside a major K-pop label and carry it, intact, into an independently controlled structure. That is not a comfortable lesson for labels to absorb. Think about what that means for the generation of artists currently in training, currently in the middle of their contracts, currently wondering what their lives look like on the other side. Lisa's path is now a proof of concept. It is documented, visible, and being watched by millions of people, including people who are not fans, who are industry professionals trying to understand what comes next. A documentary that tells this story with honesty and depth would be, in a very literal sense, a document that changes how the industry thinks about artist autonomy. Not in an abstract, idealistic way, but in a concrete, structural way, because it would show the mechanics of how it was done. That is rare, and it is significant. There is also a cultural dimension that deserves attention. Lisa is Thai. In a K-pop industry that has historically been dominated by Korean-born artists, her success and her decision to build an independent structure that operates outside the traditional Korean entertainment ecosystem carries weight that goes beyond music. She represents a possibility for artists from Southeast Asia, from South Asia, from parts of the world that the entertainment industry has historically treated as peripheral. If someone from outside the inner circle of the K-pop establishment can build this kind of sovereign career, the map of who gets to matter in global music is being redrawn. A documentary about LLOUD and alter ego would not just be Lisa's story. It would be a mirror held up to the entire global music industry. And what is reflected in that mirror is both more complex and more hopeful than most industry narratives allow. We don't know exactly what form a solo documentary from Lisa would take. We don't know the timeline. We don't know the platform, the director, or the scope. But here is what we do know. Every creative decision she has made since leaving YG, the structure of LLOUD, the aesthetic of alter ego, the partnerships she has chosen, the ones she has declined, the silences she has kept, and the moments she has chosen to speak, all of it points in the same direction. This is an artist in the process of constructing, from first principles, a career that belongs entirely to herself. And when she decides it's time to tell that story in full, in a documentary, in an album, in whatever form she chooses, it will not feel like a reveal. It will feel like a confirmation of something that was visible all along, if you knew where to look. The question was never whether Lisa would define herself beyond BLACKPINK. The question was always, on whose terms? She has already answered it, and the rest of the industry is still catching up. If this kind of deep dive analysis is what you're looking for, stories that go beneath the surface of what the entertainment world shows you, this channel is where that conversation lives. Leave a comment with the one question you'd want a Lisa documentary to actually answer. Because if this ever gets made, those are the questions it needs to ask. Hit subscribe, because this is only the beginning.